Hi, this is Maheen. I'm the editor-in-chief of Maheen the Globe, a Seattle-based independent media company covering global stories and perspectives. On March 4th, 2020, Taylor Soper, Taylor Soper, managing editor of GeekWire, and I were going to get coffee in downtown Fremont. Our plans got pushed because we were working from home. Who would have thought that this global pandemic, which is also the worst news cycle that journalists could face, could change everything? As I read on GeekWire that day, there was a domino effect of sorts, how Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft started shutting one after another. That's a day in time and a coffee that I didn't have that I will always remember, and I think so will Taylor. I am honored to have Taylor Soper, managing editor of GeekWire, on my show today. Hi, Taylor. Thanks for your time today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I'm going to just quickly start with the questions. You're a native of Portland. What do you miss most about the city there?
Oh man, yeah, I love Portland. Grew up there, went to high school there. My parents are still there, so I definitely miss them. But they're 3-hour drive, so I get to see them. And Portland and Seattle are so similar in many ways that I get a lot of Portland in Seattle. So there's nothing I really miss about it. I love Portland. It's kind of a little brother to Seattle. I guess I miss the chill vibes of Seattle, of Portland. Sorry, whereas Seattle is more of a big international, busy city, more traffic, more skyscrapers, more things, good and bad, going on. So, but yeah, Portland has a really cool vibe and more of an eccentric feel, I would say. So I do miss that. But like I said, I get to go down there every couple of months and see my parents and friends down there. So love both cities, love the Northwest in general.
Yeah, I love Portland too. I love the quirky vibe over there for sure. Um, would you like to talk about your background a little? Like, what generation of immigrant are you, and what are your roots?
Sure, yeah. My mother is Japanese and my father is American, white, Caucasian. And so I had definitely had an interesting upbringing. I feel very grateful that I have my background. I had great Japanese food and great barbecue and American food growing up. And, beyond the food, it's just nice to have both cultures, whereas, Japan and the Asian culture, education's very serious there. Not that it isn't in the States, but definitely had differing parental guidances, which I think was a nice balance. So yeah, I love my Japanese roots. I've been to Japan 4 times now. Absolutely love it. Can't wait to go back when we can travel again, when hopefully COVID gets over
Right.
one of these days. But yeah, I love just everything about Japan and Japanese culture. And just really appreciative to have both sides that my parents are where they hail from. So yeah, it's been definitely an interesting ride so far.
Right. And Umisaki House is my favorite Japanese like sushi place in Seattle. I don't know how authentic it is, but it's been my favorite one for the past 7 years.
Yes, very, very good. There's another good thing about Seattle and Portland, actually, so much good sushi and Japanese food. So yeah, Umi's is a good pick. I've been going there since I was at UW, so like 12 years. So yeah.
Wow, that's awesome. So tell us about your experience at GeekWire as a managing editor. How long have you been in the company? What do you love the most about it?
Sure, yeah. So I graduated from the University of Washington in 2012, did business and journalism there. And I was very set on becoming a sports journalist. That's just what I wanted to do. It's what I did all throughout college. Didn't get the job I wanted. And after I graduated, and didn't know what to do. And luckily, my professor forwarded me an email from GeekWire. They said they were hiring a part-time writer. Didn't know too much about the site. They had just started about a year and a half ago, so they were very new at that point. But I met the founders, John Cook and Todd Bishop. We kind of just clicked right away. I hung out with them for a couple of days, wrote some stories with them, and I got offered the full-time job. And it was definitely anxiety, and I didn't know. It came from sports where I knew everything. I knew the rules, I knew the players, I knew the context around everything. Just tech, where I'm a geek myself, but didn't know terms like bootstrapping or venture capital or any of these, more in-depth tech terms or concepts. But I said, what the heck, I love journalism, so I'm going to stick with it. And now here I am almost 8 years later. So it's been a lot of fun to be a part of GeekWire from the very early days. I was a reporter. I still am a reporter for them. But about a year and a half ago, I became managing editor. And so now I do more managing and planning in terms of our coverage, picking what we cover, how we cover it, and then also helping manage our team, the newsroom, as we cover the Pacific Northwest innovation scene. So it's been an awesome 8 years, and I'm looking forward to more years with the company. We've kind of grown as the Seattle tech ecosystem has also grown. So it's been a lot of fun just kind of being the historians, if you will, of the Pacific Northwest technology and innovation ecosystem, and tracking all the companies, big and small, and all the cool entrepreneurs and just so many cool people in the area that are doing really amazing, world-changing things. Our motto at GeekWire is, "What happens here matters everywhere," meaning that are in the greater Pacific Northwest are having impact not only in Seattle and Washington, across the US, but across the world, from two of the biggest, most valuable companies in the world, Microsoft and Amazon, to all the startups, all the science research. I could go on and on.
Yeah.
So there's just so much happening, and it's really fun to be able to, tell the stories and track what's going on and how it impacts our local community, but also the world.
Right. Let's talk about the neighborhood. GeekWire is based out of Fremont. So that's my neighborhood. I live here too, and I'm like working from home. And we just celebrated our first year anniversary. So I had these two come over from Bellingham and do the celebrations here. They liked Fremont a lot. So what do you love and hate about Fremont, Taylor?
Not much I hate about Fremont. It's one of my favorite neighborhoods for sure.
Yeah.
Poor parking options is probably my biggest complaint, but love Fremont. They call it the center of the universe,
Yeah.
which is really funny. But yes, it's like I was saying about Portland, the kind of the eccentric vibe. I feel like Fremont definitely has that. Cool restaurants, cool bars. You've got the water right there, the canal. It's close. It's centrally located. So for us, it's nice. Most of the team lives north of Seattle, so it's easiest to get to, but also easy access to downtown. Now, of course, all these things don't really matter now that we're all working from home and we're not really going to the office much at all. But yeah, I love Fremont. We've been there for several years now. Great place to just have sources come to our office or meet them for coffee down the street. So we really love it there.
Nice. So let's talk about the GeekWire Awards 2020. I'm sure it was really challenging to do it online this time around. I had both Austin and Tessa watch it as well. I can get reactions from them and then ask you questions about it. So Tessa, what did you think about the GeekWire Awards we watched last week?
I loved that they put the most importance on safety by using video conferencing instead of the traditional in-person attendance with, social distancing. And I had yet to see that being utilized before the GeekWire Awards, and the format felt perfectly aligned with the fact that GeekWire is a tech-centric journal.
Nice. Austin?
Yeah, I really enjoyed how it was honoring all technology around the SeaTac area, and it was such a multidisciplinary affair with like artists, entrepreneurs of all ages, and I just really enjoyed how creative it was being hosted in the Mopop. So
yeah, what I loved about it was that, supporting startups and the struggling, companies as well, and not just talking about Amazon and Microsoft and all the big ones. I think in that sense, I think GeekWire is really giving a voice to really like new companies. So I love that part about it. So Taylor, we can ask you your experience in getting the event together.
Yeah, so thanks for tuning in and watching, and for the kind things that you have to say about the event. The event is, we like to call the Oscars of the Pacific Northwest tech scene. So it's kind of a way to celebrate big companies, small companies, individuals, and normally we host it in a big space, whether it's Mopop or in places. Well, this year, with COVID, we'd had to push it back, and then eventually say, okay, we can't even have this event in person. And so we went virtual with it, and it was a lot of work, a lot of having to be nimble and adapt to a lot. But we partnered with a couple great companies that helped us produce it. Felt like a kind of a TV production set, and John Cook, who I mentioned earlier, GeekWire co-founder, he hosted the experience, and we actually used Zoom to produce it and bring all the finalists into their own rooms, and still got to have the vibe of the awards, and got a lot of great feedback from the community. I think just especially right now, people are looking for something positive and something to bring folks together and have something to celebrate, because if you read the news every day, it's pretty depressing. So I think that was part of why I think people really enjoyed it, and it was really cool that we were able to pull it off virtually. In a lot of ways, there was, it was better than the in-person event in terms of just putting it together, and also how easy it was to watch it and be a part of it. That being said, nothing really beats the in-person interactions that you have, the networking that happens at these types of events. So we are hoping to do the GeekWire Awards in person next year, but for this year, we were happy to adapt and change and put it on so people could enjoy it.
Yeah, I love the Mopop bits. Like you got to have the entire museum of pop like to yourself. That's so cool.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. And as you mentioned, arts and it was really fun incorporating different parts into the awards this year, whether it was the drunken tenor. He's a guy with a Seattle Opera making these little songs about Zoom, and he sang he named all the finalists, but in an opera style. And so we interspersed a bunch of those. We had really cool cameos, I guess, from people like Bill Gates and Sounders FC goalkeeper Stephen Fry, kind of, giving messages of, hope. And it was cool to kind of bring the community together and give people a platform to say some really cool stuff.
Gotcha. And so how has it been working on stories and being part of a virtual newsroom, so to speak? Because we are going through that too right now. It's quite an adjustment. And I think that's like the new landscape that we just have to adjust to in this year and the next. So I'm wondering how GeekWire is coping with it. I also wanted to do a shameless plug here and say that we've kind of launched our tech pages, and both Tessa and Austin have written the tech pieces on the big tech hearing. And so yeah, it's a fun week, and I think it's just perfect to have you on at this time while we launch our tech pages. So yeah, so let's talk newsroom. How's it going? How's GeekWire feeling about this?
Yeah, it's going fine for us. I mean, we worked remote pretty well in the past before COVID. We went to the office every day, but we already were using tools like Slack and Zoom and Google Docs and Trello and all these different cloud-based tools to work remotely. So the transition for us was very smooth. I think for us and for a lot of companies, not just media or journalism, but any company today, communication is super key. It's become even more important now that we're not sitting next to each other's desks. I think over communication is really important, just to make sure that people are all on the same page, that you really understand what projects are going on, who's responsible for what, and then also picking the right tool for that communication. So, maybe you don't need to do a 1 hour Zoom, you can just do it on email, but maybe the email is not the right format. Maybe you should do a video call. So picking the right tool for the type of communication that you want to do has been important for us. But yeah, I think it's just, we do miss being in person. I think in terms of efficiency, like yesterday we were covering the Amazon earnings report, the second quarter earnings report, and we probably took 30 minutes to get through something that we were kind of sorting through with a couple of members on the team. And if we were sitting in the same room, we probably could have solved it in maybe 5 minutes.
Right.
That being said, I think working on Slack also provides some efficiencies that you maybe wouldn't get in person. And so it's definitely a trade-off, but yeah, communication, I think, is the biggest thing. And then a lot of the CEOs and leaders I've talked to, that's always something that people are bringing up in terms of something that you really got to pay attention to and make sure that you're pretty much over communicating, whether that's with your team members or external customers, holding weekly or daily or whatever it is for your company meetings, just to let people know what's going on. Because you're not having those casual interactions at the office anymore. So, but overall, it's been pretty good for us. I mean, like a lot of companies, you're not commuting to the office, and so you're getting an extra couple hours of working, which is maybe good or bad depending on who you talk to. But we've been able to do maybe more work than we would have if we were going to the office. So definitely pros and cons, and definitely a new experience. But we are looking forward to getting back in the office. Now, what that looks like, who knows? A lot of companies, Google just announced that they're not going back to the office till summer 2021. Zillow just announced that they are indefinitely having a work from home policy. So this is a very fluid situation in terms of remote work and what that looks like. So we're just, like I said, communicating a lot and kind of playing it by ear and surveying our staff. Do they want to go back to the office? Do they feel safe? And if they do want to go back, what do we need to have in place at the office? So a lot of questions to answer for sure, but for now, the remote work stuff it's okay for us.
Got it. So how would you say the tech world has really changed, or the landscape of tech has changed, if you look at Seattle and PNW in, say, the past 10 years?
Yeah, the tech scene in Seattle and the Pacific Northwest has changed a lot, gotten bigger, I think would be the most simple way to say. Um, you look at you start with the two giants, Microsoft and Amazon. Of course, there's so many other big tech companies in Seattle, whether it's Zillow, Redfin in real estate, Tableau, which was bought by Salesforce, all the way down to Starbucks and Costco, companies that aren't really tech per se, but they do a lot of innovation and they do a lot of technology themselves. But going back, Microsoft has been around for decades now, but they've definitely had I don't know if I would call it a resurgence, but if you look at their stock price, basically in the last 2, 3, 4 years, it continues to grow. They've really, their valuation has increased. Satya Nadella has really, I think, done a good job, leading that company. And they're as big as ever now. And then, of course, you have to mention Amazon. Amazon has just exploded the last 10 years, both in terms of just how many people they're employing in Seattle. It's over 50,000 now, just to the impact that the company is having worldwide. And beyond just the e-commerce site, which is what most of us know Amazon for, but Amazon Web Services is a huge company itself. Last quarter, it brought in over $10 billion just with AWS, and that's a huge number. And then Microsoft has Microsoft Azure, so Seattle's really become kind of the cloud capital of the world in terms of cloud computing, which, as the pandemic has shown, is super important to our lives and our work. And so Seattle's just, in terms of becoming a tech hub, is just climbing up the ranks. And then you go down to the startup scene as well. The big companies are dominating, but the startup scene has definitely grown as well. There's a lot of small companies, a lot of folks from Amazon and Microsoft and other companies that peel off. They make a lot of money, and then maybe they're ready to do their own thing. They want to get off the corporate train. So we're seeing a lot of startup creation, and at the same time, there's more venture capital, so more investment dollars coming from Seattle firms, whether it's older, long-standing firms like Madrona Venture Group or Voyager, all the way down to smaller new firms like Pioneer Square Labs or Flying Fish. These are kind of smaller firms that have popped up saying, hey, there's a lot of talent and entrepreneurs in Seattle, but maybe not as much capital to help these folks build their companies and become the next Amazon. So really interesting time to be in Seattle. And if you talk to a lot of investors, they think that Seattle is the best place to start a company in the world, actually, just based on all the talent that's available. It's an awesome city to live in, right? You see a lot of people coming from the Bay Area who are kind of sick of the high housing prices and the other issues going on, so they come up to Seattle. That's not to say Seattle doesn't have its own issues. Housing is getting really expensive in Seattle, and we also have our own civic issues to figure out. But overall, I mean, there aren't that many places where you can get the talent, the nice place to live, and all the other good things about Seattle. So yeah, Seattle's tech scene continues to get bigger, and we'll see what happens here. I think Code.org leader Hadi Partovi is a former Microsoft guy, but he leads Code.org, nonprofit based in Seattle, super cool organization. But he was saying before the pandemic that if there was a recession, that Seattle would actually come out of it pretty strong compared to other cities. And I think you're seeing that right now in terms of Microsoft and Amazon just are dominating right now, and they're becoming so crucial to companies and people throughout the pandemic, and their value is going up. And so Seattle, I think when this is all done, I think we'll come out of it pretty strong. We've got really strong companies here. And so that, and of course there's a lot of bad things going on too with restaurants and smaller companies that are going out of business. So it's not all rosy, but overall, I think Seattle is going to make it through this and come out of it on the other side, hopefully, really strong and continue to be a great tech hub that attracts talent.
Amen to that. And so both my colleagues have a couple of questions for you as well. And maybe you can give you a breather and talk about the tech stories that these guys have done. They can give a quick summary. And after this call, I can even share it with you and you can critique. You're the best person too. You're like the tech guru, right? So Tessa, why don't you go and summarize your story to Taylor?
Yeah, so the focus of my article was on Facebook and Google, mainly Google's presence in China and their suppression of search results for certain news outlets on the site, and Facebook's approaches to preventing election interference and harmful content on its site moving forward, since both of these were points of concerns in front of the House Judiciary Committee.
Cool. Austin?
Cool.
My piece was on Amazon's presence in the antitrust congressional hearing that was on Wednesday, and talking about the addresses of data hoarding accusations, as well as specifically the diapers.com acquisition as well. And then going into greater monopolization concerns, which tied into all of the other companies that were present that day.
And so Taylor, we'll be doing a follow-up piece in the coming weeks once we get statements from Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, etc., to have a more balanced coverage in terms of what they have to say for these things. So yeah, so moving on from that, Tessa, what are your questions for Taylor?
Yeah, as a Seattle native, I've seen the city constantly growing with the sheer amount of tech companies moving in. It's insane. So how do you see the Seattle tech world evolving within the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, I mean, I just see it continue to get bigger, and I don't see what's going to stop it. Now, of course, there's many things that could happen, but like I've been saying, you've got anchors in Microsoft and Amazon, which there's like no other city in the States or maybe even the world that have such longstanding, huge tech companies that draw in talent. And also that talent comes out of there, and those people tend to stick around and start their own companies. So you got these two big anchors that aren't going to go anywhere for at least several years. And who knows, Amazon, Microsoft, they might fail and close up shop one day, but you just look at their stock prices and through this pandemic, how they've continued to grow, and they're not going to go anywhere. So as long as you have them, Seattle is going to be a huge tech hub, regardless of everything else. But then you start looking at, there's so many of these other companies, these I would call second or third tier companies, like I mentioned, Zillow, like a Tableau, so T-Mobile. Like these companies you don't think of them maybe as being in Seattle, but they are in the Seattle area, and those companies are growing. T-Mobile just acquired Sprint. They're a massive company. And so that's the big thing about these anchors, that they draw on the talent and they get more tech talent. And that's what you want in a tech hub. And then, the startup scene continues to just get bigger and bigger, whether it's bigger startups. Like this week I wrote about a company called Remitly. They do digital remittances, so sending money overseas. They just became a unicorn, which is $1 billion startup. And the companies like Outreach or Auth0, these are companies that have huge valuations, but still considered startups. And then you keep dropping down lower, and there's new companies popping up every day. And so in the next 5 years, I just think that the scene is going to continue to get bigger and bigger. Some things to watch out for Seattle, I think, is, beyond just the companies and the X's and O's of tech, civic integration, civic policy. What is the tech industry responsible for? Should the tech industry be paying for certain services in the city? Given that, you could argue that tech has maybe driven out a lot of longtime folks in Seattle in terms of gentrification or housing prices. And so how does the tech industry get involved? And maybe how does Seattle kind of avoid some of the missteps that San Francisco and the Bay Area have made that have really driven people out of that area?
Yeah.
So definitely a lot of questions to be asked. They just passed some referred to as the Amazon tax, but they're taxing businesses a little bit more in Seattle. And so is that going to drive companies away because of what the city's doing? Or is the tech industry going to kind of play ball and figure out how to work with the city? So definitely a lot of challenges, and I think roadblocks in the way of Seattle as a tech city continuing to grow. But all signs point to just more growth, and Seattle kind of continuing to be an epically big tech hub.
Yeah. So I'm going to go to Austin with this question. And before I do, I have a question that's going to break from the tech, or maybe controversial, I don't know. Has tech killed art in Seattle and Pacific Northwest? Like, the association that people have of Seattle with nostalgia of like the grunge movement, Soundgarden, Nirvana, Alice in Chains. Have the tech geeks kind of killed that culture?
I mean, I wouldn't go as far to say as tech has killed art. I think there's a lot of different factors. And,
Yeah.
I do think you could make the argument that techies have replaced a lot of the artists in the city, I guess, or driven them out because it's too dang expensive to live in Seattle if you're trying to survive as an artist. So I think in some ways, one of the downsides of tech growth is you kind of push out what was there before. And so, but I think there's a lot of different factors at play, and tech can do a lot of good for arts, and there's a lot of cool tech-enabled art-related projects, organizations that are popping up, and a lot of the techies contribute to the arts as well, whether it's their money or time. And so I wouldn't say tech has killed art, but I definitely think it's had an impact. And I don't think it's just about Seattle. I think every city and tech hub is dealing with this right now, is how do you preserve what made that city great,
Yeah.
while continuing to grow as a city. But yeah, that's a good question. I wouldn't say it's killed art, but I would hope that Seattle can maintain that, the music, the arts, you know, the theater, and let's keep that stuff around, but also, you know, have tech continue to grow. I'm hopeful that they can kind of work together and we can have both, but we'll see.
Yeah. So Austin's actually a singer songwriter, and he's part of like a couple of bands. One's a solo act called Harbor Day, and the other is called Hockey Teeth, which is an indie rock band. So I was wondering if this was concerning him or not. But Austin, go ahead with your tech questions, please.
Thank you so much, Maheen. So I was wondering, being an Oregon native, how does the startup scene in Portland compare to the startup scene in Seattle?
Yeah, there's definitely startup activity in Portland. It's just nowhere on the same level as Seattle. I talked about the anchors before, Microsoft and Amazon. Or Portland doesn't, in the Portland area, they don't really have those giants. Now, Intel has a really big office in the Portland area. Nike has their world headquarters there, but there's not a huge tech giant there that, like I said, draws in the talent, and it kind of you build a tech hub off those big giants. And so plus Portland's always lacked that. Also just not as much, you know, venture capital going into Portland. So just there's not as many entrepreneurs. But that being said, there's definitely companies that have come out of Portland, whether it's Puppet or other companies like that that have, you know, they've either raised a lot of money and gotten big, or just had a big impact. But yeah, nowhere near. I don't know what it is about Portland. I think Portland just likes being Portland, and they don't want to become the next Silicon Valley or even the next Seattle.
Yeah.
But yeah, just not as much activity. There's just not as many entrepreneurs. It's not, you know, you might go into a coffee shop in Seattle and run into an entrepreneur, or, you know, they'd always say that, you always hear that about Silicon Valley, is you go into a coffee shop, or like, what startup are you doing, or what company are you gonna start next? So it's kind of in the water in Silicon Valley. Seattle is kind of like that, but I think Seattle has a really good balance of not everyone's doing their next tech startup, but Seattle has way more of that than Portland, which Portland, you know, I don't think have that as much in terms of in the blood, in the water, where startups are a thing that people do in Portland, or you go to Portland to start your company. So
Yeah.
that being said, there's definitely activity in Portland, and we do write about Portland companies quite a bit, but just not maybe like 1/10 or 1/8 of what's going on in terms of in Seattle. That being said, Portland's still cool. It's a cool tech city for sure. Just not an international tech hub.
Yeah. Well, thanks for your question, Austin. I had a couple of quick questions for you. One is, what's your favorite socially conscious tech company and why?
Yeah, that's a good one. There's a lot of startups that are doing cool things, but I probably just go with Microsoft. I mean, if you look at what Microsoft has been doing over the past couple of years or so in terms of their carbon related announcements, like they want to become like carbon negative, which means that they're going to make up for all of the environmental, they want to clean up their past excess, which is really interesting. And so they've announced several initiatives over the past couple of years in terms of how they're going to be more green, how they want to be carbon neutral, I think by 2030 or 2040, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, Satya and Brad Smith, the president, have done, I think, a really good job of pushing that forward, and they've kind of become a leader in that. And now you're starting to see other companies almost follow them, like Amazon. Amazon's got their climate pledge, and if you follow Seattle or Seattle sports, you know, they've just renamed the hockey arena the climate pledge arena. Jeff Bezos has, you know, put a lot of money. He has his own earth fund, billions of dollars going into that. So definitely another thing about Seattle to watch is how Seattle, big companies and also startups, are contributing to environmental related initiatives, whether it's using their own technologies and services and software and hardware to help solve problems, or just putting money toward different initiatives. So really interesting to see what these companies are. And you know, some of it is kind of marketing and PR. They want to look good and they want to seem like they care about the environment, but I think they're actually putting enough money and enough investment with both time and dollars that, you know, you could see some serious change and impact coming from their actions, which is pretty cool to see.
Yeah. And so you said you're a sports fan. Any favorite Seattle sports teams, including the Seattle Kraken that has just been released?
Yeah, they might become my favorite pretty soon. I love the logos and the color that they released a couple weeks ago. I wouldn't say I have a favorite. You know, I'm from Portland, so the Portland Trailblazers, the basketball team, is definitely my favorite by far in terms of sports teams. But I love all Seattle sports equally: Seahawks, Mariners, Sounders, and look Storm, Huskies. You know, go Dogs. Definitely looking forward to when we can get sports back. I know that, you know, there's been shortened seasons that are starting with the NBA and Major League Baseball, but just doesn't feel the same. And so hopefully COVID can end soon and we can get back to the stadiums to cheer on our teams. But yeah, I guess that's another thing I didn't talk about Seattle with the sports. I'm glad you brought that up. It's great sports city, and definitely a lot of cool teams to root for.
Yeah, so we are, I know, a little over time, but these two have a couple of more questions. If you have time, we can go ahead.
Yeah.
Is that cool? All right, cool. So
Yeah.
Tessa, can you go ahead and ask your next question, please?
Yeah. So after the pandemic, how do you see GeekWire's news coverage changing? Will it look any different in the next couple of years?
That's a good question. I think a lot of companies are asking themselves, you know, rethinking how they do work and what they're selling and how they're selling it, and what they're doing. For us, I don't know if I think we're still covering the news as news, and maybe the tools that we're using or the strategies that we're using are maybe a little different just because we're remote. But I wouldn't see it changing a lot coming out of COVID. You know, we're still very just committed to covering our local community. You know, telling the truth. You know, getting cool stories, tracking what's going on in the ecosystem, whether that's funding rounds or people getting hired or you know, good and the bad news. So, you know, I think the core of journalism and what we do is not going to change. I think that's been our ethos since the beginning. But you know, we are like trying out new tools for remote work or maybe different ways of getting information to folks. But I think people are, you know, you're still reading the news, you're still reading it through the internet, whether it's COVID or not. So it's not really making us rethink the big strategies too much in terms of what we're doing. But yeah, so I don't see any huge changes. But who knows? It was such a crazy situation that we're living through, not just with COVID, but the economy and social unrest. So there's just so much happening right now. It's hard for anyone to predict. But that being said, I think with technology specifically, you know, stuff is getting accelerated. Stuff that people thought that was going to happen, you know, in 5 years is happening in 5 months, whether it's healthcare with virtual visits. You know, I did my first virtual visit a couple months ago and it was awesome. Like, I think people are realizing some of these tech-enabled services are really great, and the pandemic has kind of forced that into us, I think, which is a good thing. So there's really interesting innovation happening that's happening really fast, and there's tech companies that are definitely benefiting from that as we kind of get through this crisis.
Nice. Austin?
Yeah, my question's like surprisingly in line with a lot of what's going on right now with this big tech hearing. And how does the monopolization of the tech industry interact with rising startups? You touched on this a little bit earlier, but I'd love to hear more.
Yeah, I feel like Jeff Bezos and you're the Congress questioning me.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, it's such a no. I'm just kidding. It's a fascinating topic, and if you watched and I'm glad you guys covered it. I mean, it's such an interesting topic in terms of these tech giants and, you know, how much power they have and whether they are monopolies, which in a lot of ways they are, but, you know, is that a bad thing? And so I think it's tough to apply the current monopoly laws and the antitrust laws to these companies because they're so different than maybe like a railroad or an oil company back in the day was. And, you know, the big question is it bad for consumers that these companies like Amazon and Apple are getting so large? And you could argue that, you know, you're using Facebook to contact your friend, which is useful. You're using your MacBook right now, maybe you're going to buy something on Amazon that you really need. You don't want to go to the store, and you're using your iPhone to call your grandma tonight. So in a lot of ways, these big tech companies are making our lives really better and easier. And with that being said, there are big questions that need to be asked that the CEOs were asked in terms of how much control they have over whether it's Amazon's marketplace. You know, Amazon can see the data in terms of the little tiny startup in Arizona that's selling toothbrushes at a crazy rate, and maybe they'll go create their own toothbrush and then put it above the Arizona made toothbrush on the marketplace. Is that unfair? I think those are the questions that Amazon needs to answer, and the lawmakers need to figure out how to make it fair for everyone. Or is Apple taking 30% cut of purchases made on apps in their app store? Is that fair? It's just a really thorny conversation and situation, but as journalists, it's fun to kind of cover and see where it goes.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's good overall for the American consumer and worldwide folks around the world that these big tech companies are getting scrutinized. They need to be. They're getting very large, and if you look at what's happening with the pandemic, it's kind of two sides of the coin, where you see these companies like Amazon and Apple and Facebook they're continuing to grow bigger, billions of dollars in revenue, while the economy is kind of in shambles and people are losing their jobs, and the unemployment's, I think today, is going to run out, this extra $600 a week, and so you're going to see people that are just really suffering.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, these big companies are just getting bigger, and so the chasm is getting wider. So yeah, this is a fascinating topic, and definitely one that's going to continue as these companies get bigger. So I don't have a clear cut opinion on it, but definitely just tracking it like you
well,
guys
Taylor,
are.
thank you so much for your time today. We're honored to have you on, and I hope we get the coffee that was due a long while ago, but once this pandemic is over.
Yeah, I can't wait to do